Okay, we are recording. Welcome to our Master Gardener class tonight. We've got, let's see, how many people? We've got 39 people out there in the Zoom world, and we've got one in here. Bob come in person. So, and tonight we've got landscape design, and this has always been an interesting topic to me, and I wanted to hear somebody else teach it this year. And so Taylor is an extension agent. She does the horticulture programs in Williamson County. I started to say Rutherford. Williamson County. And you've been there what, two, 3?
No, I've been there a little over a year.
A little over a year. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So well, this is Taylor. So Taylor, take it away.
Thank you, Carla.
Okay.
I appreciate y'all letting me come and speak. And as Carla was talking about earlier, I did not know there might be a standardized one. So this is just my own presentation. It's actually I was an Alabama extension before I was here in Tennessee as a horticulture agent. And Renee Thompson was one of our specialists. And she actually was a landscape designer before she worked for Extension. And so she put that together, this presentation for all of us to use. So some of these pictures are mine, some are hers. It's kind of a hodgepodge. So a lot of good information. Landscape design is a tough topic to talk about because a lot of what we do with design is interpretive. It is kind of your own interpretation of what a good design is. But as we go through this, what we're going to focus on are the key principles of landscape design that will help you get started. So if you don't even know where to start with the design, we're going to start with the basic principles. And we'll go through those principles and kind of the thought process behind design. We'll talk a little bit about plant selection. And then if my husband can get away, we have our 2-year-old, but he is an actual designer. He's a landscape architect. And so I'm hoping I can get him to come over and talk about the actual design process, putting a pen to paper, because he does that every day. So I'm hoping I can get him in. If not, you'll just have to have me. I did study landscape design in college. That was my track that I was going to take. And after I took some design classes, I realized I enjoyed doing it, but I took forever to do it. And it was something that I didn't really see myself doing every single day. And so that's why I went into extension. But anyways, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, questions in the chat box. And it's going to be hard because this is as with any Zoom class, I'm going to ask questions, but it's going to be hard because you're not here in person. So if you have some thoughts on some of these questions that I'm going to ask you, go ahead and put them in the chat box so everybody can read them. But when you think of design, what do you think of makes a good landscape design? Just kind of think in your head, what makes a good landscape design? You know, some people will say curb appeal. Yes, curb appeal is very important. When we design a landscape, we want it to look good, aesthetics. You know, maybe it's something about not having a monoculture. Maybe it's having a wide variety of plants makes a good landscape design. You know, balance, things like having planting material that connects throughout the landscape and make it look like a cohesive design, a cohesive experience. So there's a lot of ways that a good landscape design can be made. Maybe it's using clean straight lines. Maybe you are a minimalist, you like a modern design, and this is about as minimalist as you can get, but it's still a design. There was still a thought process. There was still a plan. It was maybe a very simple plan, but it went with what they wanted. They have a very symmetrical house. They have a very minimalist home. And so they wanted a landscape that matched that. To you, it may look like just a few trees thrown in there, but there was a thought process behind it. So, and what makes a good design? We look at this picture here. Well, I mean, there's not much out there except for grass, you know? So would this be considered a design? No. Having a good landscape and a good design, a good plan for this could elevate it from just a plain building And when we add those plant materials, we can make it more aesthetically pleasing. We can add some foundation plantings, and we'll talk about what different types of plantings, but foundation plantings, it'll kind of break that horizontal plane where the grass meets the building, where it looks like there's just this big gaping hole. We can fill it with plant material. So what makes a good landscape design? Right here. And honestly, you guys, it's, if you want to unmute yourself, if that's okay, Carla, is that okay with you? I know you're recording, but if y'all want to unmute yourself, if somebody's got it, it'll kind of help us think through things. So who likes this design? You can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself. Anybody?
Come on, I know we got some talkers in this bunch. Go ahead and unmute and think.
Okay, well, I like that. It looks good.
Yeah, looks good. Okay. Who thinks this isn't a design? Who does not like this?
Gerald's got his hand raised. Go ahead. Gerald.
I think he was saying he liked it.
But Harold Evans, I'm trying to figure out how to raise my hand. So,
So I find that there is a vast majority of master gardeners like this. And I would say, yes, this is a design. And when I see this, yes, it's very natural. It's very kind of wild and woolly. But what I see is repetition. And we'll talk about repetition and how important repetition is for design. But I see repeated elements. I see pink, not just in the foreground, but in the background. I see purple, not just in the foreground, but in the background. And what that does, things like repetition and reusing colors and plant materials and textures, it makes a cohesive design. It makes it look like you did it on purpose and you didn't just throw a bunch of plants or mow a pathway through a field. So having those, it may just be a little something. It may just be that you put purple here and there and down the way, but it makes a design. And what it does is it causes the eye to move down through that and find those repeated elements, that cohesiveness, and it makes you want to wander down this pathway. Now, to some of you, this may be a little too natural. You may be like my mother. She loves a good formal design. If I put this through this at her, she would say, no, thank you. Because she did ask me to design her house one time, and we have very different ideas of what a good design looks like. And so, you know, we never did really agree on a lot of things. But with this, in a very natural sense, you've got these curving bed lines. And there's a key word right there, bed lines. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can have a design by just putting bed lines and putting in planting beds. And that can turn your landscape into what feels like you actually intended it to be a design. You actually intended it to look that way. So here we have what I consider a good design, a very natural design. In this one here, who says this? Who thinks this might be a design? Who thinks this might be, they just mowed a path through a field?
Looks like cover crops to me.
Yeah, it does look a little like there's some cover crops mixed in there. So this is what they wanted was a prairie, meadow. Yeah, and so they put thought and intention into this. Now, is it very formal? Is it very structured? No. But for them, this is what they wanted. They wanted a very natural prairie meadow type look, and they were able to get that with plant material selection and hardly any hardscapes or anything like that going into it. So a lot of times when we think of design, we kind of have to manage our expectations, especially when you're working with a client or someone comes up and asks you for advice. You can't just think about what you like, you know, you have to think about what they would like as well. So in here, you know, again, we're kind of looking at and saying, you know, what makes a good design? There's no plant material in this. There's a couple of potted plants, but for the most part, this is hardscapes. But to, you know, to someone, this might be exactly what they wanted. And when they said they wanted low maintenance, they got low maintenance. There's no plant material to think of. So, this one's kind of teetering that edge of, is it a landscape design? Is it not? I mean, we're not using plant materials, but we are designing. We are breaking that horizontal plane, kind of breaking that up where the grass meets the building and adding something of interest. Maybe it's not even an in-ground feature. Maybe it's a container of some sort. Maybe you've got an old feeding trough, or, I've lived a lot of places and I've seen a lot of planted toilets in the front yard. Some may say that's not design. Hey, to each his own. So it may not even be that you have a firm established design, a firm established landscape. You've got something that's transitional throughout the seasons and something that adds interest and color and fun. And that's what you wanted. And so that to you is a design. Maybe it's a fun feature. Maybe you want a giant checkerboard or chessboard in your landscape, or a tree house for the grandkids or kids to play in. You can add fun, whimsical elements into design as well. Now, I know this probably appeals to a lot of people. This is kind of that homestead kind of feel where we've got a little bit of formal with our hedgerows here, our boxwood hedges. We got some chickens running around. And we've got a beautiful garden in the back. Now, I would say if you wanted to start a garden, this would be a big undertaking. We always recommend starting small. And even in design, in landscape designs, you do it in phases. Unless you just have to get it all done then and you've got all the money and the time and the patience. But a lot of times it's best to do it in phases because you may change your thoughts and perceptions of what you wanted in the landscape. This is one of my favorite pictures. And one of the reasons is because purple is my favorite flower color. I just love purple flowers of all kinds. But maybe your design is, and this is kind of natural, but maybe it's more perennial. It's not established shrubs and trees. It's a bed that changes throughout the seasons. So here we've got what we would call a monochromatic landscape. So we're using different shades of purple all throughout the landscape. And so it makes it cohesive, whereas we have a ton of different textures and lots of different plant material kind of shoved in a small area. Having those pops of purple and keeping that purple consistent throughout makes it less chaotic and makes it feel more cohesive and planned. And it's also a nice kind of juxtaposition to that gray house. So we've got a very neutral house. And so that purple kind of pops and gives it a little interest. Whereas if we had just done all green, it may not have been as interesting and it may have blended in with the surroundings. So when we're talking about design, there's a lot of steps in the process. So if you were looking at this house, what would be your first step? Say I come up to this house, what would be your first step in the designing this property? And there's no wrong answer. There's lots of right answers, but
Flower beds.
What was that?
Flower beds.
Flower beds. Okay. Yeah. It
I'd
looks like
start out with some trees.
some trees. Yeah. We got a wide open space, an open palette.
Yeah. Yeah, Bob said trees here.
Trees. Yep.
A lawn.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would
And
think
it looks like
I think you'd want to throw down some organic matter and aerate and get a lawn established before you try planting trees.
yeah, there's a very blank canvas here. So it'd be nice to have a lawn and maybe some trees to make it feel more intimate and less open. Flower color. So when I look at this and I think of all those different things, my first thought is I need to do a site analysis because I can't pick flowers, can't pick trees, can't do any of that without knowing what's going on. So before we think plant material, and that's the first thing my landscape design professor was like, you're all horticulturists, you're all master gardeners. We think plants first. But when we're talking about the design process, we think site analysis, soil testing, we want to make sure we're putting the right plant in the right place. And so that is key. So when I'm looking at a blank canvas like this, my first thought is let's do a site analysis. But of course, being a horticulturist, I am also thinking like you guys, ooh, this plant would go here, and I think this would be good here, and we need some color. But we kind of got to rein our plant nerd selves in and think about the design process and what needs to come first.
Come on, wait.
All right.
Sweet.
So what about this one? Does this appeal to you guys? What do you think is an issue that might be present in this landscape?
Trees need to be pruned.
Some big old trees, right? Those trees. This is a case of they didn't really think through the mature size of those trees when they put them in. So that's another thought process when we are going through design is right plant, right place, maturity size. So when these trees were first put in, yeah, it looked great. But as they got bigger, they dwarfed the house. And honestly, it's not safe to have those trees so close to the house and so close to the sidewalk where people are going to walk. They look pretty healthy now, but who knows when they might not be healthy. I got muted. I keep saying the host is muting me. So, all right, y'all can hear me. Good. Okay. So with this one, maybe it's a process of limbing up a little bit so we can see the house, because when we're designing, one of the first things that we, as a designer, you look at with a residential property is the front door. We're always trying to lead the eye and lead traffic to that front door. That's kind of the eye of the house. So here we're kind of missing that element, and we're just missing the house in general. So maybe it's a case of limbing it up until we can eventually maybe have these trees removed and replaced with something that's better suited for the size of the property. Things to think about when I go out: drainage. Oh, this year, you guys, if you had a drainage problem, you probably figured it out this year if you hadn't figured it out yet. We had so much moisture. I dealt with so many, excuse me, so many calls on drainage issues and plant material not doing well because the soil was just so wet. I will tell you, drainage problems are one of the hardest things to deal with on a site, especially if you're in a new development and they're constantly regrading and changing the soil level and things like that. You will deal with drainage issues. And there are ways that you can mitigate those problems in a nice looking way. Some of these examples we talk, rain gardens. I'm not sure, y'all probably have talked a little bit about rain gardens and environmental stewardship. And so having things like that, the bottom picture is a dry creek bed, which you may have seen someone who has one of these. And what it is basically we are guiding the flow of water using hardscape materials, using rocks, and making it look aesthetically pleasing. So it looks like a dry creek bed, but that is where we're funneling that water and taking it off of the landscape. Or you may do something like French drains and things like that. So there's that dry creek bed. So we've got plant material along it, but this is where the flow of water was going through the landscape. And so they couldn't get turf to grow. They couldn't get a lot of things to grow. And so they decided to raise the sides and purposefully take that water and run it through the landscape and make it look nice. Here's another example of that, where up against this building, they had a lot of drainage issues. I mean, they've got some nice looking turf there, but I'm guessing as it got closer to the building, the turf struggled. And so this was a way for them to move that water through the landscape. And I know everybody's city, whatever, has different ordinances. I know in Williamson County, we have to retain the first 2 inches of water. So we've got to find a way to keep it from running off site. And so something like this can help it filter and drain, whereas it would normally may run off site. French drains. I'm sure a lot of you have probably had someone or talked to someone about this or had one put in your own landscape. It's just a way to help drain that water off of site, off of your site. And then of course, rain gardens. are a good small fix. I guess you could do a large one, but rain gardens are going to help filter the water. These plants don't necessarily love sitting in the wet, but they'll tolerate sitting in the wet. So usually find plant material that doesn't mind having wet feet or sitting in water as it filters out that rainwater and helps it drain. And usually we put these near gutters, downspouts, areas that don't drain very well. So here's another picture. And as you're looking at this, where does your eye go? Anybody?
Mine
goes to the yard.
To the yard, that nice, beautiful green landscape. What else?
The door.
The door, right? You know, after I see the garage door kind of stands out because it's white. But if I'm looking at the house, my eye goes to that front door. And that was the intention of this design. They didn't put anything tall in the landscape to block that view. Now, of course, I put a couple of crepe myrtles on either side of that, which eventually will probably, I think, it's hard to tell. Maybe crepe myrtles, but, or looks like standard something. But eventually those may get too big for that spot. But right now, it looks nice. And they've got a pathway. They've got a guided pathway up to the front door. It leaves it open. They've used symmetry. So they've got a flanked porch with the same plant material on either side. They've got matching hanging baskets on either side. And so that symmetry makes our eye go straight through it. Whenever we've got two of something, our eye goes right in between it. And so having that flanked porch and having the same thing on either side makes our eye go right to that front door, which is what their intention was. They want it to be inviting. Another thing I noticed with this landscape is the monochromatic. So we talked about how, you know, having the same color throughout kind of adds symmetry. It adds repetition. It makes it feel like it was intentional. So even above the garage in that planting box are white flowers. So they kind of wanted a more simple landscape. They added some color, but it was in a very muted way. So it was almost minimalistic in its color scheme. Here are just some pictures of drawings that the lady that I was talking about did design, some of her drawings of different landscape designs. And what she kind of was sharing with this is how you can make different rooms in your landscape. So we talk about design, and oftentimes we need to think first of how we're going to use the landscape, the functionality of it. Instead of, you know, aesthetic appeal is great, but if I can't get to where I need to go, or if it doesn't serve the purpose I need it to serve, then it's no good. So in these pictures, you can see where she's got pathways, and she has, you know, fire pit and seating areas in some of these, and play areas, turf areas. All of these are thought processes we need to have. How are we guiding people through the landscape? How are we using our landscape? This is just a pretty picture I like. I like I said, I love purple. But this is a good example of using perennials and herbs and using mixed textures in a landscape and leaf colors to add interest to a landscape. So what catches your eye with this picture? What's the first thing you see when you see this picture?
That red bush.
That red shrub, right?
Mm-hmm.
What else? Anybody see something different?
I see the one on the right side. The
That
left
green one?
is not centered.
No, it's not.
And
And it looks like they cut out part of it so you could see through the window.
Yeah, so it may not be in the right place.
Yes.
Something
when
would
I look at this
pretty
landscape,
there. Yeah.
It, you know, it looks good. I like that they have a mulch bed around their tree instead of sticking it in the middle of the turf.
Mhm.
It looks like it's planted high, which is good. But I think they missed a step here. my eye goes straight to that red tree as well, and that's a Japanese maple. And it's a great focal point tree. The problem is that big tree to the left, which is a Fothergilla, is also a great focal point tree. And so, yes, it's white, but it is big and blooming. And when I'm looking at the house, my eye doesn't really know where to go. It goes to that tree to the right. It goes to the Japanese maple. It goes to that tree to the left. So when we've got 3 focal points sitting in the front of the landscape, our eyes get kind of confused. They didn't make it cohesive. There's not a lot of repetition of plant materials. There's too many focal points. So it almost seems like they did it in pieces and it's not one cohesive design. So, taking out that tree that's kind of off center and kind of half in a window, half not, may help with that. Moving the Japanese maple or adding another Japanese maple on the other side. So it kind of leads you to that front door. So there's some symmetry there. It's just a little bit, in my mind, when I'm looking at it, kind of chaotic in the sense of my eye doesn't really know where
Sorry,
to go.
dog.
So in these pictures here, we've got some good examples of functionality. This is a backyard. They wanted a path. Well, they had worn a path in the turf from that back fence. And this is the fence here, and you can see it. This is the same fence here. They had worn a path through the turf and the turf wouldn't grow. And they, it didn't look good. They didn't like how it looked. They didn't like the use of it. So, and in this picture, they're trying to get back to this area in that back corner, and they had put some paving stones down, but really that turf was hard to maintain, hard to mow. It didn't always look very good because a lot of our turf just won't handle high traffic, especially with our clay soils compacting it. So what they did is they made planting beds and they made permanent pathways. And so with those planting beds and permanent pathways, they did lose some of their turf space, but for them, they weren't really using it except for to walk through to begin with. So having those pathways and having those planting beds made it easier to maintain that turf. It also made it more aesthetically appealing. When you don't just have patchy turf and weeds, you've got some actual designated planting beds. So this is kind of an example of rethinking the landscape and how they wanted it to function. This one, I love this picture. And I want to know what y'all think. This house has a great, a nice looking landscape, kind of monochromatic because they've got a lot of textures and colors going on with the house. So I think that's nice. But what do you think the purpose of this planting bed right here in the turf is? What do y'all think the purpose of that bed was? Anybody?
I think it's to keep people from walking on that portion of the lawn.
You're one of the first people that has gotten that on the first try. They have people, us, path of least resistance.
Yeah.
We can cut a corner. We're going to cut a corner. They have people cutting through their yard and compacting that turf, and it always looked terrible. And so they, instead of, telling people they weren't allowed to walk through it, et cetera, they just put a planting bed down. They said, well, now you can't walk through it. Now you have to go around and go down the sidewalk. So this is a way of adding something later on. This is an example of functionality and also of maintenance, of making it, they made it look good, but they also guided the path of people moving through the landscape in a pretty way. So yes, they put that there because people just kept wanting to cut that corner. And it
also helped with drainage coming from the downspout.
Yes, it also helps with drainage. So their downspout is right here and pops out in the landscape, and they have one here too, and it pops out here. So that can help with drainage as well. So it kind of solved several problems. So we've looked at a bunch of pictures of different types of design and kind of gotten an idea. And, the first question someone might ask is, why do I need to design. And this is actually an older survey. I would bet that a newer survey would increase the value. But yes, curb appeal is important. A well-designed landscape can increase property value by at least 17%. So when someone's on Zillow or whatever you're trying to sell your house and they see a house with no plants in front of it, it's not going to be quite as appealing. And as a master gardener, you know, that may be one of the first things you look for. I know when we were looking for houses, the yard was super important to me. The outside space was very important. Whereas some people, that may not be the first thing they look for, but I feel like more and more people are concerned about outward appeal of the landscape, living in the landscape, being outside more. And so having a good appealing landscape can help with your property value. And talking about appeal, you know, you got to decide what appeals to you. What do y'all like about this design? Or don't like?
The fullness.
I
of it.
like all the color.
Mm-hmm. All the color, the fullness, yes. What else?
I like the stones that they have beneath the flower beds.
Yes, I like those stones too. Stone beds, very nice. When I look at this, I see a lot of design elements. And again, we're going to talk about those in a little bit, but my eye goes to the door. I want to walk up to the door. That is where the pathway is leading me. But I also see repetition with plant color. We see the reds and the pinks, those warm plant colors, which are nice up against that creamy neutral house. So you get it makes those colors pop more and gives a little more excitement to the landscape. Also, if you notice, there's the repeated element of roundness. So you notice the shrubs are round, the beds are curved and round. We even have a round container here. So we've got kind of the repeated rounded design, and even the pots here too. So whereas the house has a lot of sharp angles, it's kind of smooth with those curving lines. All right, so getting into the principles, and did you want to take a break now, Carla, or did you want to take one in a little bit?
Just whenever you're at a good stopping point.
Okay, it was about 6:45, so
Yeah, it's almost 7, so
yeah, if y'all want to take just a quick 5-minute break,
10
and then we'll
minutes.
start getting into the principles.
Okay, yep. We'll come back at 7, or well, about 5 till 7. I'm sorry, my clock here in the room is fast.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, we can come in the 5 to 7 will be in about 10 minutes.
Okay,
Is that good for everybody? Okay.
all right, go take a break.
Y'all ready to get started back?
Yes, ma'am. I think so. Whenever you're ready to go.
All right, let's get going.
Okay.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone. And we're going to get down into the nitty gritty of some of the principles of landscape design. First, we'll talk about the practical principles, which is oftentimes they are not considered and they should be. And then we'll get into the basic principles of landscape design. So I'll go through these relatively quickly because they are, practical. When we're thinking about landscape design, one of the first things we need to think about is who is going to use the space and how are they going to use it. So in the top right picture, we see a play set. Maybe they've got kids, maybe they've got grandkids who come and visit often. So we need to make sure that that landscape is functional for them. Maybe you host a lot of, so sorry, y'all. Maybe you host a lot of parties or get-togethers. So having a space to do that in, that should be one of the first thoughts when you're doing a design is how am I going to use this space? The first thing my landscape design teacher said to us when we got into class was maintenance, maintenance, maintenance. We should always be thinking about how we're going to maintain that landscape. Who's going to maintain it? How are they going to get to where they can access everything they need to access? So we're not making really sharp, odd angles that a mower can't get to. And we're not covering up our air conditioning unit with pampas grass that'll cut us up anytime, or whoever comes out to service it is going to get cut up when they try to get to it. So we need to think about how we can get through the landscape. Pathways, whether they're grass, soft pathways or hard pathways with flagstone, bricks, pavers. Thinking of how you're going to make it and how you're going to get through that landscape and get to where you need to go. So in these pictures here, we have a before and after, and the way it kind of speaks to functionality is in the before picture, it was kind of just a bare open area. It didn't really serve a purpose. They didn't utilize it. And so in the right picture, what they turned it into was a cutting garden. And it's not full sun, it's part shade. So they got some plants that would do better in that scenario. But they took an area that was not functional and turned it into a functional landscape. And this is what the wife uses. She wanted a cutting garden, so that's what they turned it into. And they did that with bed lines. They did that with plant material. And where once before your eye just kind of goes straight through it, they added a focal point. And we'll talk about focal points. And that center focal point kind of stops the eye and kind of keeps it present and keeps it right there in the landscape and doesn't let it wander off to where they don't want the eye to go. Maintenance. We think about functionality when you think about maintenance, whether it's you don't mind having a high maintenance landscape or you want a low maintenance. You think about, with lower maintenance, we're not using as many fertilizers. We're hopefully not using as many pesticides, water, etc. And a lot that goes into that is right plant, right place. So in that top right picture, we have what you would probably say is a low maintenance landscape. We just very minimalist, just a few small trees and shrubs. Except for weeding, if they've got a big weed problem, a weed would be pretty obvious in this scenario. Not as high maintenance. The bottom picture can go one or two ways. I find when I ask people if it's low maintenance or high maintenance, I hear both. And when I look at it, I can see why you would say it could be low maintenance. But when I look at this, the first thing I think of is I've got a monoculture. I've got a couple of monocultures. And what a monoculture is just the same plant material used over and over again. So in the front, we've got the variegated plant that's going along the hedges, and it's the same thing all the way down. Just like with the hedges, which are boxwoods, we've got boxwoods, the same thing all the way around. And when I look at this, it looks great when it looks healthy. But what happens when one dies or when one starts to look bad? It's going to stick out like you're missing a tooth. So yes, it is low maintenance in a sense, but any little thing, any little change to that, where there's a weed sticking out, one of those isn't looking as healthy as it once was, one's, trimmed a little bit differently, it's going to stand out. So it's slightly more high maintenance in that sense. We need to think about the environment when we're thinking about designs. This is something that I think master gardeners are great about. You think of the right plant, right place. You think of the problems and the environmental stewardship that goes into a landscape. And so when we consider those aspects, we're going to have plants that are less stressed. Anytime we have a plant that is stressed, it's going to be more maintenance. There's going to be more labor, money, resources that go into maintaining and keeping that plant alive. So right plant, right place, thinking of the environment and utilizing your landscape in a way that's environmentally friendly. Cost effective. Well, this should be a no-brainer, but I do find a lot of times we get really excited and we have a budget. We don't always stick to it, but you can put in a nice design that is cost effective. Maybe it's doing it in phases. Maybe it's taking your time and letting it grow. I see so many times people want that instant effect. They want that, it looks like it was been there for 50 years, but I did it overnight. And with plants, that's just not realistic. And it's not the best idea as far as plant health. The smaller the plant is when we put it in, the easier it's going to establish, and the healthier, realistically healthier it's going to be. So if we put it in as a giant tree and we're transplanting it into our landscape, there's a higher chance that it may not establish well. So starting small, letting things fill in can help make it cost effective. It can also lead to having a healthier, more established landscape that you're not having to replace plant material all the time. Or you could end up like my parents, and they got someone to design their landscape, and 10 years down the road, everything was so overgrown and full, we ended up pulling out, every other plant that was put in there. It got too crowded. It looked good initially, and then it just got overgrown. Right placement can bring down utility costs. You can also enhance the positives and downplay some of the negatives with a good design. So one of the big negatives of this house was the slope. And so what they did is they took that slope and they turned it into a way that they could use the landscape better and make it look better. So now they've got kind of a retaining wall here. They've got some drainage they put in, and a way for that water to flow and a place for it to go, but also a way to keep the soil from eroding, and a pathway that leads to underneath the deck where normally they may not have been able to use that space. Now they can use it. So yes, they had a big negative to work with, but they made it into a positive in doing just landscape design. We also want to make sure that it's visually pleasing. And again, that is relative. What looks good for me may not look good for you. So, but making sure that it looks good, that you like the way it looks. A good landscape design is a matter of managing the viewer's eye. We've talked about this. With any good design, we want to make sure that the eye is going where we want it to. Maybe it's like this picture here, the first picture on the left, where it's leading us up to that front porch. We've got a neutral house, kind of neutral hardscapes, even an almost neutral with the plant flower color, but it's guiding us up to that front door. Or maybe it's like the top right picture, where they used this staircase, where once it was just a slope that you couldn't get up, and it was hard to get up to the house from the sidewalk. They created this staircase and this flanked design so that your eye and you want to walk up to the front of the house. Or maybe it's like this one where we've got these beds that curve along the house, and maybe they're saying, hey, keep on driving. Look at our house and drive on by and keep on going through the driveway.
Two of those houses look like the way they've done it, they just look like real butt busters. Let a little bit of rain or let a little bit of snow or ice get on there. I don't think they thought safety through.
Yeah, that
Well,
stone one,
they
yeah, for
They
sure.
didn't consider rails on those multiple steps either.
And that's good to think about. You know, if you've got kids or you've got someone who can't walk as well, isn't as mobile, or just anybody in general when there's an ice storm, yeah, that's something to think about. How are you going to move through that landscape? Is it even functional to have those stones there when someone's going to slip and fall?
Yeah.
That's a good thought. All right, going into landscape design, those were kind of our practical principles. Is it functional? Is it cost effective? The maintenance requirement, is it environmentally friendly? Now we're going to get into more of the artistic concepts and the principles of design. How do we make a visually pleasing landscape? And how can we guide and enhance our creativity? So this is just kind of a starting point. If you have no idea where to start, these are good places to start thinking about design. So we've got several principles we'll talk about, and each of these pictures kind of goes along with them, and I'll kind of go through them really quickly. But those principles of design are unity, simplicity, variety, proportion, sequence, and balance. And we'll go through each of these. The first principle is unity. And it is our overriding most important principle. Unity can make or break a landscape. And if we don't do anything else, any of the other principles, we need to make sure that our landscape is unified. So in this one, in these pictures here, you can see picture on the left is repeating trees and shrubs that tie the landscape together. We talked about that earlier, but repetition is a part of unity. Repeating different elements, different colors, different textures, repeating those throughout a landscape can take what is a big landscape and make it feel smaller, make it feel cohesive, make it feel like it was put together intentionally. And in the picture on the right, it does the same thing in a different way. We've got a similar color pattern. You know, we've got curving lines that are repeated. We've got straight lines that are repeated throughout. Whereas it's a very off the wall design, they've got repeated elements that help make it unified. So unity is basically elements and combinations that bring all the many parts into one cohesive unit. So within unity, we talk about repetition, whether it's a repeated color, a texture of a plant, a form, maybe it's repeated hardscape materials. Maybe you use the same brick along one pathway as you use down another, and it connects the landscape. It is our overriding principle. It is the most important. We want to make sure our landscape feels unified. And that is one way we can manage the viewer's eye. We can make it aesthetically appealing. Elements should tie together. And we want kind of a good blend of simplicity and variety. We don't want it too boring, but we don't want it too chaotic. And there's a lot of ways you can do this. So in this picture here, what are some of the ways that you see repetition used?
All of the roundness.
Yes, right? Even the top of that gate is rounded. What else?
Oh, the clay color.
The clay color is used all throughout. It's the stone, the pathway, the pots, the fence, that same terracotta kind of color. Anybody else?
The symmetry.
Very symmetrical. Yes, we've got repeated elements on either side of that gate. Now, the good thing they did here is they also made a focal point. So that fountain is kind of our focal point. And our eye doesn't go straight through the landscape. It kind of stops and rests for a while and kind of looks around. But we also have symmetry on either side, so that kind of guides us through that gate. What else? Anything else?
Height of the plants.
Everything's kind of the same height. Yeah, we've got to kind of, we don't have a lot of juxtaposition and heights. They're kind of all in that same neutral height.
The
And
color,
what was that?
I was going to say the color kind of layers, like you have the likeness together in lines.
Yeah, so we kind of have a layered kind of color effect there. And when we think of colors as well, we've got also repeated kind of that warm color tone repeated throughout. And you've got little pops of purpley, but it's kind of purpley pink. And so it's almost monochromatic in the color scheme as well, which unifies it. So they've used repetition in so many different ways that now this may not be your cup of tea, but it is one it's cohesive. This is cohesive design where it looks like it was planned on purpose. It wasn't just thrown together. And it kind of calms the mind. It kind of like calms you down. It doesn't look chaotic. Your eyes not bouncing all over the place.
I think of having to clean that bird bath.
See, you're very practical. You're thinking of maintenance and functionality, which is important. They may hire somebody to wade in there and clean that out. Who knows?
Yeah, that bird bath costs more than my whole front sidewalk.
Oh, I bet that bird bath costs more than my car probably. So Unity, we're tying the landscape together. We're repeating, using repetition to unify it, whether it's a repeated color, line structure, material, texture, etc. Using similar, I talked earlier about backgrounds and foregrounds. So if you have a larger landscape, having something repeated in the background and the foreground to connect it. And then having focal points like this fountain, they're going to make it establish dominance and unify the group because we all have one thing to focus on that kind of keeps our eye in the design. So connections strengthen unity. And this is where I was talking about. And what Renee would tell you if she was teaching this, if you don't do anything else, if you can't afford to put another plant in your landscape, make bed lines. Unify the landscape by connecting your different planting elements. So on the left is the same plants as on the right, but they made it into a planting bed. They used bed lines, whether you just shovel edge them, you use that nice stone or brick or whatever, you make bed lines, and that can help unify the landscape. So we're not just sticking a tree in the middle of the turf, we're making a bed out of it. And maybe we can connect it to another part of the landscape. Focal points. So when you look at this picture, what do you think the focal point is?
The big white tree.
Big white tree, right? That's where my eye goes first.
Looks like it's growing out of the pot, but it's not.
It does look like it's growing out of the pot. I think it's kind of like a folly, kind of like a trick of the eye. And that was most likely intentional. What I think is that green pot in the middle may be the focal point at some times of the year. But when this tree is blooming, and you can see they've got the gate open so you can see it better. So maybe when this tree is blooming, that's the focal point, and they open up that gate, and having that green pot that kind of blends in with the landscape allows this to be the dominant feature. And so maybe when times of year when it's not blooming, they close this gate and this becomes our focal point. So they're kind of managing your eye. They're taking it to where they want it to go. They've got this symmetry on either side of this gate, and your eye wants to go straight to that tree. So focal points can draw attention to or away from something. The unity of three. So this is something we
My
kind of.
husband is asking why anyone would want to use a pot like that for a focal point.
people have all kinds of interests.
Like it's
Never
a big
know.
old ginger pot.
I was gonna say
Maybe-
the same thing. I said the
It's just kind
pot
of
is
weird.
taking away from the whole thing.
Whole thing. Maybe they
Unless-
stick some pretty flowers in it at some time of
That's
year.
what
Who
I was thinking. Maybe they stick things into it when that tree's not in bloom.
Maybe
Or-
so. Maybe they add some purple flowers or something in there when it's not in bloom. Who knows? Maybe it's a water feature and shoots up in the air. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not in my mind, maybe not the prettiest pot, but maybe it is to look like that tree's coming out of the pot. Who knows? So going into the unity of three, this is what I talked about earlier when I talked about symmetry and having two of something and your eye going right in between it. In a natural world, or in our mindset of, nature, we think of natural things happening in odd patterns. It's not even. When we see something even, we think man-made. So you probably do this in your own landscape and don't even realize you're doing it. You know, when we put plants out, we don't put 2 of something, we put 3 of something, or we put 5 of something. We do an odd number. We kind of stagger 5 plants instead of 4. When we have just 2 of something, our eye's going to want to go straight through. It's not going to stop at one or the other. It's going to go in between them. So when we have 3 elements, so we have, let's say in these corner plantings, 3 trees, our eye's going to stop right here, you know, because physically that tree is going to stop our eye from going further. If we didn't have this, our eye would want to go, our view would want to go right in between them. So using the unity of 3 law to kind of make the landscape feel more natural, feel more cohesive, managing the viewer's eye. Or let's say we want them to see something, so we're putting even numbers of something on either side so that our eye goes right through. Repetition we've talked about a few times, but repetition is just repeating similar elements, whether it's texture, form of a tree or shrub, color, hardscapes, things like that. So repetition allows our eye to move smoothly from one thing to the next. So in here we've got, repeated elements where we've got the same plant material used along the bed line. We've got, the same mid-level plants, same tall plants. These are all repeated throughout and kind of lets your eye go smoothly. We also have a good height differentiation. So we don't just have turf and trees and there's nothing in between. We've got kind of low, medium, and high, and it lets our eye kind of gradually go up. Repetition strengthens unity. It's kind of the key to unity. It can be achieved through form or texture. So if you're looking at these, maybe you don't use the same exact plant on either side, but you use something that has the same spiky texture, or maybe grass-like texture, or the same form. Maybe you've got pyramidal tree here and a different pyramidal tree shaped here. So using different forms, or you can just repeat entire planting units, and that will give you repetition and give you cohesiveness and a unified landscape. So that's unity, most important. Simplicity, just like what it says, it's a more simple approach to landscape design. And again, repetition is key. It is a part of simplicity as well. We're not using a lot of different things in here. We're repeating elements. So it's not boring necessarily, but it's not chaotic. Now you may look at this and say, this is boring. This may not be your cup of tea. What do y'all think about this design?
I think it would take an awful lot of maintenance to keep those shrubs up in that condition.
Yeah, you see a guy out there mowing, then they're probably out there all the time.
Yeah, but it's the snowball bushes and everything. It's really pretty. I like it. I just want the staff to keep it up.
Yeah, it's gonna take some maintenance. Yeah, I like that. I think it's pretty. It's very monochromatic. I am a fan of monochromatic landscapes. Very simplistic.
I love it. Very elegant.
Yes, but it has a more formal feel to it. And
Yeah.
when we see symmetry, and we'll talk about symmetry in a little bit, but symmetry lends itself to formality. When we have a symmetrical versus an asymmetrical, it kind of makes it more formal. And if we look at that house, that's a very symmetrical house as well. You know, we've got a little bit longer on one side than the other, but I mean, we've got the 3 dormers, we've got the 2 round windows on either side, we've got a very symmetrical house. So a symmetrical landscape kind of enhances that. So we use simplicity and we'll talk about variety, but we use both of those together. Too much of one or the other can either be boring or it can be confusing. So we kind of have to find that balance between the two. Simplicity is limiting change. And, you know, one of the common errors we can make in a landscape is doing too much. Throwing, you know, we are all plant collectors. And we could start our own botanical garden in our backyard, but it wouldn't make the most cohesive design, having one of everything. But if that's what you want to do and that is what appeals to you, then do it. You know, most important, do what makes you happy. But if we're talking about design and the sense of create the, artistic elements. We don't want it to be too simple, but we don't want it to be too chaotic. This might be a little boring, just boxwoods. That's it in front of the house. Might be a little monotonous, might be a little boring. One of them gets blight, especially, then we're gonna have a big problem because we won't have any plants left. So breaking things up, adding some interest, mixing plant materials. You can have simplicity, but it not be monotonous. You can use repeated colors, textures, plant materials, and add some variety without it looking too chaotic. Variety. Variety is adding different textures, different colors, different forms, adding a lot of different elements, and that brings interest to the landscape. Who likes this design?
I love it. It looks like a Thomas Kincaid painting.
Yeah, yep. Yep, some people are raising their hands. So I find master gardeners, not in general, I don't want to speak in generalities and assume about you, but I find a lot of our master gardeners like this because we have a lot of different plants going on. But for some, this is chaos. This is too much. And this is a lot going on. I think what they did well here was bed lines. So we have very defined bed lines. So everything's kind of contained. We have the sense of it being contained. It's not spilling out into the landscape. There are also repeated elements. The blue foliage color is repeated throughout. The warm color scheme, so reds and pinks and yellows, are repeated throughout the landscape. So we don't have a whole mixture of a lot of different things. Yes, it's a lot, and this is maybe too much for some. I feel like if something died in here, we may not miss it. We may be able to pull it out and you wouldn't even notice. So it's good for that sense. But, we do have, while it is a lot going on, we do have repetition, which unifies the landscape and it makes it feel slightly less chaotic. And I always like to point out, someone pointed this out to me, I never noticed it before, but there's like a little dinosaur topiary inside here as well. So we got a little whimsical element. So again, too much of variety can be chaotic. It can be confusing. Your eye doesn't know where to focus. Variety is the absence of monotony. So maybe it's not just you've got a fully stuffed landscape. Maybe you're adding variety through a lot of different colors. You have an old dead tree and you want to plant inside of it. Variety is just something unexpected. It could be something whimsical. It could just be adding different types of plant materials so you get those different textures, you get those different colors. If you do too much, it can sometimes be confusing. And having that balance is important. And I always ask, are you a collector, plant collector? Be honest. A lot of us are. We want one of everything that we see. But there's ways you can add those into your design and make it more cohesive. So proportion, we'll move into proportion. Sorry if you hear my little boy crying. It's getting close to bedtime and he's over there crying. So proportion. We'll talk about proportion and scale in landscape. Again, as we go through these principles, unity is the most important. So these are important, but slightly less so. So this is kind of the same as that picture we saw earlier, where this tree, way too big for the property size. When it was first planted, it was probably great. The first 10 years or so, it was nice. It fit well. Now it's too large. So the proportion is off. When you're looking at plant material, you always want to look at the mature size and know what you're putting in the landscape. So now it looks like they're trying to sell the house, and this is a bit daunting. What if that has to come down? That's not going to be cheap to remove. It doesn't make the home seem very inviting. It's kind of, the door's kind of blocked by some cycads, it looks like over here. So, we've got kind of an overgrown landscape that maybe wasn't well thought out ahead of time, and proportions are off. So proportion, which we're going to talk about, is not balance. And we'll talk about what balance is, but proportion is basically the relationship among different elements in the landscape. And when we think about how things relate to each other in, with respect to size, so large and small elements need something in between to kind of break them up. We talked about grass meeting a building. When grass meets a building, we need something in the middle to break it up. We need those foundation plants. Very large materials like that tree can be intimidating. We usually don't want something that big in a smaller home. You want to make people feel welcome. You want to bring things down to the human scale. So would you say this is disproportionate or proportionate?
Proportionate,
Proportionate?
yes.
Anybody think this is disproportionate?
I think it depends on the lot size.
Yeah, we're only seeing half the picture here. We're not seeing the full lot. But if this is just, what we've been given, I would say in scale to the house, yes, it is proportionate. It's about the same size as the house. It's not overwhelming the house. It's not really tiny and puny. So for now, it's proportionate. Now, if it gets bigger, we may have a problem. But yes, lot size is going to be important on that as well. Does this feel proportionate when you look at it, or disproportionate?
Disproportionate for now.
For now, exactly.
But
10 years
then
down the
again,
road.
I think it would be too close for when it gets bigger.
Yes. So maybe they didn't think through mature size and placing, I see it all the time, a river birch 5 feet from a house.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, what are we going to do? Down the road when the roots are breaking up the foundation, or we got to pull it out, thinking about those things. So right now it may not be proportionate. It could eventually be proportionate, but by the time it gets that big, yeah, maybe it's too close to the house. So proportionate is just talking about size and scale. Sequence. So with sequence, this is kind of a mixture of a lot of the different elements, and it's basically just moving through the landscape, with whether it's walking or your eye moving through the landscape. It's a supporting element. It's not as important, but it's one worth mentioning because we talk about graduating plant sizes or maybe textures or colors, and maybe we're moving from low to high or turf to trees. Sequence is basically just moving the eye through the landscape. A lot of what we do with design is managing the viewer's eye. Where do we want their eye to go? Where do we want them physically to walk? Do we want them to move through the landscape, or do we want them to kind of step back? Sequence is a way we can achieve that. So maybe we've got short up front and tall in the back, like in that top right picture here. We've got our taller elements in the back and we've got our shorter elements up front. And it kind of makes us want to wander down that path and see what's at the end of that. Or maybe it's that we're curving through the landscape and we go from short to tall to medium height to tall as we get closer to the house. So it's kind of making our eye go wander up to the house. It's just all about movement. And then balance. These get confused a lot with proportion, but balance is talking about how, and I know a lot of these are artistic concepts, and so it's how it makes you feel. And a lot of this is very subjective, which I've mentioned before. So this is how a landscape makes you feel. And when we talk about balance, a lot of times we talk about symmetry and asymmetry. Symmetrical landscapes, where elements are exact mirror images on either side, have a more formal feel, a little more static, maybe a more classic feel to them. Symmetry is where you have the same thing on either side of a central axis. The weight visually is distributed equally, whether we're talking about symmetry or asymmetry, it's an equal distribution of weight, which makes it balanced. So in this bottom picture here, we've got our central focal point is the statue. And on either side, we have a mirror image. And I like this design because it's formal, but we have some elements that make it slightly less formal, you know, with the what look like hydrangeas draping down in the back, a little more natural looking. So it is a very formal feel. They've added elements to make it slightly less so. Symmetrical structures can lend themselves to symmetrical landscapes. So we have a very symmetrical structure here. And so we have the repeated design on either side, which goes with that structure. Some issues we see with symmetry. It can be boring. If it's too simplistic, we don't have a lot of variety, and we're doing the same thing over and over, it can be a little boring. If you lose a plant, say one of these Italian cypresses dies on one side or the other, it can lose balance. It can make it feel off balance. Maybe you've got an asymmetrical house, and that really doesn't lend itself to a symmetrical landscape, and vice versa. Asymmetry has a much more casual feel. It can indicate movement, and really just with movement, we're not necessarily talking about physical movement, but eye movement as well, because you've got a little bit more variety going on. But we're still distributed evenly. The visual weight is still equally distributed. So in that top picture, we're looking at it as, yes, we have more plant material, mid-sized plant material on the left, but on the right, we've got tall and short. So yes, it's different, but the visual weight when we're looking at it is the same. And this is kind of a better example of that. On the left picture, it is very much one-sided, very lopsided as far as balance. On the right, they've used different planting units. They haven't used the same thing on either side, but they've got a larger plant on the right. And then to make up for that, on the other side, we've got 3 smaller plants. So the weight and balance of that is even. It's distributed evenly. And so when we have an asymmetrical house, sometimes we can't do symmetrical landscapes. They lend themselves, like I said, more to asymmetrical landscapes to kind of help balance the visual weight. On the top left picture, we've got our house, which is on one side of the property, very heavily weighted. So on the right side, we've got a larger tree and more plant material that can kind of help balance it. Did they do a great job? I don't know, a little. What do y'all think? What do y'all think about that left picture?
I like it.
Yeah, they did a pretty good job. And the top right picture is kind of hard to see, but we've got on the more of the houses on to the left, and so most of the landscaping is done on to the right side of the house to kind of balance it out. Do we need to take a break, or do y'all just do the one break, Carla?
Now we can just keep pushing forward if you're okay.
Oh, keep it on. Let's go.
All
All
right.
right. So those are the principles of design. Most important, unity. If you don't do anything else, create some bed lines, unify that landscape, repeat some elements. That'll make it feel intentional. As we start going into the more in-depth into the design process, we're going to start talking about plants, our favorite part, and how they function in a landscape. And again, functionality is important. So are those plants serving the need of the space? Each plant can have its own purpose and function. So maybe it's just to look good. Maybe it's just an artistic element. And using ornamental plants and even edible ornamental plants can add and enhance to a design and add another layer. We're going to talk about different types of plants and how they're used in the landscape. We're going to talk about focal point plants, accent plants, foundation plants, and a lot of these are kind of self-explanatory, but we'll go through them. The first thing we're going to talk about are focal points, or specimen plants. These plants demand attention. The Latin root for those, to look at. It's something to look at, is where our eye is going to go. Usually it's something unique. And for the most part, when we look at a focal plant, there's just going to be one of whatever it is. So in these pictures here, you'll see a river birch planted too close to the house. So eventually that's going to be a problem. But for now, that is their focal point. Now you will see crepe myrtles, and crepe myrtles can serve multiple functions, and that's something we'll talk about. There are certain plants that can serve different functions depending on how you use them in the landscape. But these are plants that are going to demand attention. They're going to draw the eye. It's one that you're going to want to single out. Can anyone guess probably our number one specimen plant that is used in the landscape?
Crepe myrtles.
Crepe myrtles are common, but usually a lot of people plant more than one of them.
My husband says kudzu.
Yes, it is the vine that ate the South. But there's one
Japanese
plant I feel like
maple.
is almost always used as a focal point.
Japanese maple.
Japanese maple. That is probably one of our most common, well-loved, and used focal point plants. It's not to say that crepe myrtles aren't used a lot, but a lot of times we plant more than one of them. I would say Japanese maples almost always are used as a focal point plant, and we don't plant a whole lot of them. First, because can be very expensive, but also they just demand attention. They have a unique structure and unique growth habit, unique leaves, and so they just kind of are almost the quintessential focal point, and they take center stage. Some examples of focal point plants, specimen plants. Fringe tree. This is one that usually when I see it planted, I don't see multiples. They usually have just one, and it has also can be called Grancy graybeard, has fluffy white blooms in the spring. Dogwoods, a lot of times are used as specimen plants and focal point plants. Camellias can be. Maybe it's that you espalier it. You grow it two-dimensionally up a wall or up a structure. A lot of times espaliering a plant can make it a focal point, whether it's a camellia, a pear, an apple, whatever you decide to do that. Viburnums can be. Now this one's kind of like with the crepe myrtles. It can go multiple directions, but snowball viburnums especially can get huge, and they are definitely, when they are blooming, a focal point. Of course, Japanese maples, probably our most common specimen plant that we use in the landscape. Some other ones, crepe myrtle on our list. A lot of times, anything with interesting bark. It doesn't just have to be flowering or have a leaf color. It can have peeling bark like our river birch. Blooms like our Japanese magnolias in the springtime, those saucer magnolias have those big, beautiful blooms. Maybe it's something that's a focal point in certain times of year. And then at other times of the year, you've got something else that's kind of taking charge in the landscape and dominating. Maybe it has an interesting texture like weeping or twisting. Those are all ways we can use specimen plants and use unique plants to kind of create that focal point, that dominance in the landscape. Accent plants. So this is kind of where it gets a little tricky, because you'll see some of these that I've already mentioned before. Accent plants are the softer side of focusing on one particular item. It may draw you to a place, but maybe not necessarily itself. And a lot of times this is because we put more than one of them. So things like hydrangeas, probably one of our more common accent plants, because we usually plant more than one. Yes, that accent plant draws the eye, like in this top left picture. This draws my eye, but this is unique and there's only one of it. So my eye or my view is going to go from here, from these accent plants to that specimen plant, that espalier or that tree form, whatever. So accent plants are kind of used to enhance and bring someone to a certain spot in the landscape. And then you have something like in this picture where we have some accent plants that are, yes, striking because they've got that light green chartreuse color, but our focal point is this big spiky textured container plant. Or maybe our focal point is the seeding area and they're just enhancing that area. Yes, they are attention grabbing, but they're not necessarily drawing the attention to themselves specifically, if that makes sense. Some very common accent plants: azaleas, rhododendrons, hydrangeas for sure. Spirea. Usually a lot of times I see it planted in a hedgerow, and when it's blooming, it is very much a focal point, but it brings your eye, and maybe it brings your eye to a house behind it. Rudbeckia. You can even use some of your perennials as accent plants. One of probably my favorite plants to use in the landscape, and it's a native, this the pink muley grass. Very interesting, very unique. Usually you don't plant one of it, so it becomes more of an accent plant than a focal point, but definitely a lot of these can be focal points depending on how you use them. So boxwoods can be another one. Annuals and perennials can also be used in this way, where we're enhancing a particular spot. Corner plantings. Well, if there wasn't a term that was self-explanatory, this one is. Corner plantings are exactly what they are describing. We are planting on a corner. We're softening an edge. So let's say it's the corner of a fence. So we're using our plants to soften that corner. You know, in this one, we have that rule of 3 being used, where we've got 3 of a plant. And so that stops our eye, brings us back to landscape. But we've got 2 crepe myrtles, which still guide us to this spot. So yes, they want us to see this spot. They don't want our eye to go beyond that. And so we're also softening up that corner, that harsh corner of the fence. Maybe it's the corner of your house. Maybe you don't like that harsh corner of your house. And so you're going to soften it up with just a planting. Any plant can be a corner plant, depending on how you use it. So this is not necessarily plant specific. It's more functionality. How are you using that plant? So here they created a corner. Maybe you've got a huge landscape and you want to make it seem smaller. Maybe make a room within your landscape. So you can create your own corner. Here they use Japanese maple, some boxwoods, azaleas, some spirea, all to kind of soften that corner of the house. And we already talked about this one. So it just a group of plantings that softens a corner of a landscape or a home. Foundation plants, kind of jumping back. Very important part of landscape. We're softening that horizon where the grass meets the house, or where the whatever weed patch meets the house, whatever you got, we're softening that up with some planting units. For the most part, our foundation plants are usually evergreen or a mixture of deciduous, evergreen, annuals, perennials. There's usually something there all year long. So a lot of times things like boxwoods and hollies are used as foundation plants. Again, we're just softening that plane where the grass meets the house, where there's that big juxtaposition. We're not going from really loaded, really high. We've got a middle ground. bring it back to human level. Boxwoods, of course, probably one of the most popular foundation plants. I like instead of a boxwood, I like a dwarf Yaupon holly. It's a native, a little bit hardier in my opinion. Looks very similar to a boxwood, but gets that same effect. Pittosporum. Okay, so this is kind of this is from Alabama. We're getting far north for a pittosporum. I don't know if anybody here grows any. We're getting a little too far north. I need to probably take this one out of my slideshow to really grow pittosporum really well. Nandina, another very common, very popular foundation plant. This is something important to remember. I put firepower. We have a lot of different cultivars of Nandina, but it's important to remember Nandina, the original Nandina, can be invasive. Most of the new varieties available in the market are sterile, supposed to be sterile, so they don't grow seeds that can be distributed by wildlife and make it invasive. So if you're buying new Nandina, it should not be the invasive kind. Always check for berries though. If it's growing berries, cut them off, get rid of them. Camellias can be good foundation plants. They can be quite large in some instances, so maybe not the quintessential foundation plant, but they make a nice on either side of the porch or, in the corner of a house. The camellias would be a nice kind of grounding plant there. Now, I don't know about you, but gardenias are just temperamental for me. They like it just so. And I have a hard time getting them to grow where they don't want to grow. So yes, they can be good foundation plants if you can get them to grow. Is anybody successful with gardenias?
Well, I have 3 cuttings from a beautiful Arkansas species that took off and have now started to have yellow leaves and are getting fickle, and I'm getting a little heartbroken. So I'm hoping it'll work.
I hope so too. Just know it's not you. Gardenias are temperamental plants. And again, we're getting to a point where we're getting further north than they do ideally. So never on the north side of your house do you want to put a gardenia, somewhere protected, somewhere where it doesn't get too much sun, but doesn't get too much shade. Again, they just kind of like a very specific growing environment. But as soon as I say that, someone will say, oh, I've got it grown on the north side of my house and I never water it and fertilize it. It does great. Plants will do amazing things. But in my experience, sometimes they can be a little temperamental. Foundation plants examples, some of the ones we talked about, some other ones that I see commonly used, Cleyera, also known as Turnstromia, very popular. One I see up here all the time are laurels. A lot of people like to use skip or ship laurels, however you want to pronounce it, as foundation plants. Junipers can be. Gardenias on there twice. I don't know why. Ligustrum. Now this one you've got to be very careful with because several of our ligustrum species are invasive. That's our privet. You can even use ferns as foundation plants. We have several nice outdoor ferns that do well, like autumn ferns and holly ferns that can make good foundation plants. Border plants, again, kind of self-explanatory. These are plants that are going to create a border or a boundary or an edge along a planting bed or unit. It doesn't need to be a screen. These can be nice short plants. A lot of times we see hostas. Probably one of the number one plants I see as border plants are daylilies. Maybe it's something small shrub. Maybe it's arborvitaes. We're just creating a border with these plants, whether it's tall or short. Screen plants, we have a great publication y'all may have already talked about on screen plants for Tennessee landscapes. Wonderful. Gives a lot of good options for evergreen plants that would do well in Tennessee, because we do find a lot of people use Leland cypresses, they use arborvitaes, and unfortunately, those will get problems over time. Arborvitae's a little less so, but anytime you plant something, it's best not to have a monoculture where we're doing the same thing in a line. If you can stagger your plantings, give them space to breathe and grow, or maybe mix it up and do different mixture of plants, that'll be healthier for the environment, healthier for the landscape, better for your plants. But yes, screens are just things we want to either block a view or keep a view in, or not let someone see into our landscape. That's just screen plants. And again, we have a great publication on screen plants. Hollies, very common screen plant that we use. Cleyera can be, or Turnstromia, however you pronounce it. Now that you see a picture, you probably noticed these before. Very hardy, evergreen shrubs. They don't bloom or anything, just kind of nondescript. I gotta take this one off too, because we're just too far north for tea olives. But if you've ever smelled a tea olive, oh, the smell is so good, in my opinion. I wish we could grow them really well up here, but they're just we're a little far north for them. Arborvitaes, probably our most popular screen plant now, especially since we're moving away from Leland cypresses. And there's lots of different types of arborvitaes that you can use, not just the green giant. There's emerald green and smaller dwarf type arborvitaes as well. There's the Skinner dwarf American arborvitae, lots of different options. So with screen plants, it's usually something evergreen, but it can be a mixture. I like to have a planting mixture. Maybe you're mixing a magnolia with some hollies and maybe some junipers or some type of cypress or something like that, making a planting mixture that creates that screen. Shade plants, I mean, whether it's a plant to provide shade or plants to do well in shade, we do have options. A lot of our shade plants aren't necessarily going to be big flowering plants. We're going to have foliage plants like coleus, Linton roses, heuchera, which are coral bells, if you're familiar with that term, hostas, ferns. We do have options though. And then of course, when we're thinking of design, we may want to think long-term down the road. Maybe I want to put a tree in that's going to provide shade. Maybe I won't get to experience it, but maybe whoever lives in the house next, down the road will get to experience some shade from this tree. Hostas, of course, unless you have deer, then you'll have like half a hosta. Autumn fern, I mentioned these before, one of my favorite landscape ferns. We do have some cold tolerant, nice ferns that can go in the landscape, and autumn ferns are one of those. Holly fern's another one that I like. And there it is. I would if I could, I'd want my backyard to look like Jurassic Park, ferns like everywhere. I love shade plants, so a lot of our hydrangeas and ferns and things like that I love, but I don't have a lick of shade in my yard. So right plant, right place. I don't have shade. I can't put the shade plants I love. So I'm better off, managing my expectations and putting in something that's going to do well. Of course, shade trees. I mean, yes, of course, oak. Any of our big trees can become shade trees, but things to think about is these are slow growing. So it's gonna be a long time before you get shade off of some of these trees. And so you kind of got to think about how long you're willing to wait to have shade, and how big a tree is gonna get. We have some smaller maple varieties. We have some bigger ones. And honestly, and Carla can probably tell you better than I can. She's a tree expert. But red maples are kind of falling out of favor with me. They just have a lot of problems, and I see them not used well in a landscape. And so they end up getting more issues like girdling roots and borers and other issues.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Still a beautiful tree though on your farm.
Beautiful. Yes.
Yeah,
beautiful.
it just depends on where you plant them. They're not the best, right in your landscape, front yard. where you've got to mow and you're gonna, you're gonna have to fight those roots eventually. So it's all about placement.
It is,
It's all
right?
about
Plant right.
placement. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So when you've got a good spot for it and you know it'll do well there, you can pick a plant like a red maple, but putting it as a street tree, terrible idea. And I see it done all the time. Something like a tulip poplar, big tree, big tree. You got to have space for some of these bigger trees. Great, nice native tree, but yeah, it's big. So whether it's a tree that or a plant that's going to create shade or grow in the shade, we do have a lot of options. And we have a lot of good publications that'll tell you what plants like what, whether they're perennials or they're woody ornamentals. A few more things to consider. Thinking about your landscape in all the different seasons. And this is something I've always intended to do, but I haven't. But carrying a notebook around, if you're starting a design or you want to redo your landscape, take a year or so as you're thinking it through and kind of create a list of what's doing well and what seasons and what you like. And because you want interest all throughout the year. And that doesn't necessarily mean that something has to be blooming all the time. It can mean that, but maybe it's the exfoliating bark from a river birch at parts of the year, or berries on a shrub, or maybe it's something that's blooming at, all different points throughout the year. Having that interest and making sure your landscape doesn't have periods of where it's just all looks like crap. So just kind of thinking the thought process, looking down the road and not just what looks good now. Always plan before you plant. Always make a good plan. And we'll talk about design. But whether not just design wise, not just drawing it up, but thinking about plant material and planning it. Some artistic elements, just things, fun things to consider when you're designing. Some artistic elements. We talked about the dry creek bed. We talked a little bit about color, having color themes in your landscape can help with unity and it can help add interest and fun. One of my favorite color schemes, again, is the monochromatic, but there's lots of different options. Maybe you want a warm color scheme. So our warm colors are things like reds, yellows, oranges. These are attention grabbing colors. If you've got a big landscape and you kind of want to make it feel smaller and more intimate, use warm colors. Warm colors make things feel smaller. Maybe you've got a really small landscape and you want to make it feel more open and bigger. Think of a cool color scheme using blues, purples, greens. These are more calming colors. They're more relaxing. They're going to make things feel more open. There's a reason that most planes are blue inside. The materials and things are fabrics and all that are blue. It's a calming color. It's not as intense as red. My sister painted her bedroom and we all got to pick a color and she chose hot pink. And we got about halfway through and oof, it just hurt your eyes. It just hurt to be in the room. It made it feel like you were suffocating and it was closed. The walls were closing in on you. It's too much in a small space. So thinking about those, or maybe it's not a warm or cool color. Maybe you want to do an complementary color scheme. So that's complementary colors are ones that are across the color wheel from each other. So red and green are complementary colors. Orange and blue are complementary colors. War Eagle, sorry, had to put that one in there. If you're an LSU fan, purple and yellow or purple and gold, complementary colors. So they naturally go well together. Probably one of my favorite color schemes besides monochromatic is purple and yellow or purple and orange. I kind of like those two together. Get a little cool, a little warm, but they're cohesive. They go well together. Maybe you want to have an all white garden. Maybe you have a red brick house, and so you want to do white up against it to have a good contrast. A lot of times with red brick, you don't necessarily want to put pink or red colors up against it because it kind of blends in. It doesn't stand out. So thinking about those things are kind of fun when we get to start thinking about the plant material. Maybe you want to have a themed garden. Maybe you want to have a butterfly garden in the shape of a butterfly. Maybe you want to have a salsa garden, or pollinator garden, something along those lines. This is, when you can start thinking about those fun elements. Thinking about form, not just color of a plant, but form. So I really like this diagram. So we've got pyramidal, we've got columnar, we've got weeping, and the last one is shrubby. I've never heard of a plant described as shrubby, but I guess a shrub would be shrubby. I don't know. But it always makes me laugh. But plants have different forms. It's one of the ways I identify plants when there's no leaves on them. When there's no leaves on a Bradford pear, I can still, unless it's been pruned back, probably tell you it's a Bradford pear just by the way it's growing, the shape of it. Same with cherries. Cherry trees have a very distinct vase shape. They grow like this. And so when there's no leaves on it, I can still tell by the form of that tree. So trees have different shapes that we can take into consideration when we're designing. Or maybe it's textures, not just necessarily through flowers, but through leaf size. Maybe you've got some fine textured small leaves and some coarse textured magnolia big leaves. Maybe you've got peeling bark. Maybe you have a grass that kind of moves with the breeze and adds an element of variety in there. Maybe it's berries and flowers. So there are a lot of different ways we can add interest in the landscape without just necessarily using a bunch of different plants. Oh, we already went through that. That kind of repeated. All that said, all that I've said, 2 important things to remember. Start small, whether it's a pot on your front porch or one bed in your house at a time. Have a plan though, it's good to have a plan of what you want, but start small and create something you like. Make sure you like it. I can tell you till you're blue, I'm blue in the face that pink and yellow don't go together. I don't know, that's just an example. But if you like pink and yellow, do pink and yellow. It's all, you're the one that has to live with it. So make sure you like it. The only real one, principle that I really want you to remember is unity, and that can be achieved in so many different ways. Like I said, just by adding bed lines or pathways in your landscape can create unity. Other than that, it's up to you. Design is definitely subjective, and it's what you like that's most important. Questions right now? Carla, have I missed any questions in the chat box?
And unmute. Let me check here. We've had several comments. Let's see. Oops. Is this computer? No, a lot of them were just answering your questions as you went through. Is this a question about hardscape and or large plant elements? That was Kathy McKinney. Or is that just a comment on a picture? It must have been just a comment about a picture because
Okay. Well,
hardscapes and those areas are very important parts of your design too.
okay. Well, if y'all don't have any questions about that, we're not going to take a break, but I have my husband here who I mentioned is a landscape architect, and we've timed it just right to where he can kind of tell you about the design process and kind of go through what goes into putting a design pen to paper and what he deals with on a day-to-day basis. And he, like I said, he does mostly commercial design now, but he used to do residential, a lot of residential design. So he definitely has the experience behind this. So I'm going to turn it over to him. So everyone, this is Drake Reeder. landscape design extraordinaire, and he's going to kind of go through and talk about design.
All right, thank you.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
As Taylor mentioned, I'm Drake. We both met in horticulture, so I got my undergraduate in horticulture because I love plants. And then I went and got my master's degree in landscape architecture. And I've been practicing for about 8 years now. So I love design and I love the design process. So I enjoy teaching about it whenever I can. So, there's 4 basic parts of the design process: creating a base or site plan, depending on how some people call it, and then going through conceptual design through the diagram phase, which leads to plant selection, and then of course your final design. You can see here on the right, this is kind of a final design, example of a final design. So a base is one of the most important things you can create. It's also one of the hardest things to do as a homeowner, or if you're helping out a friend, because it's not very easy to not many people have their house plans just lying around. So, and the important part about having a base is having an accurate base. So sometimes that can be difficult. I tell people, the paper with the squares on it are amazing because you can make those 1 foot. But basically a base plan should consist of your accurate home placement, the accurate dimensions of both your lot and your house, and then things such as like your existing hardscapes, if there's any like drainage easements or any covenants, any things that kind of established on your final plat. So those things are important to kind of show on your base because those are kind of limitations. And like I said, a lot of times when you buy your house, you get a plat, or your HOA a lot of times will have a digital version, ours does, of our plat online that you can access. So the first step is to make copies and then choose a scale. And the scale can range from, if you're doing a small bed, you may do a 1 inch equals 1 foot. If you're kind of doing your whole landscape, it may go up to 1 inch equals 10 feet. It just depends on the size of your landscape and what you're, trying to design in. A couple things. It's always nice if you can have a survey because it's accurate and it's kind of a legal document. Of course, not everybody's going to get a survey when you're just doing a landscape design. Like I said, a lot of times a survey was done on your house. If you recently bought your house, or if you've bought your house in the last few years, there's probably a survey done and submitted to the Office of the Probate. So a lot of times you can find it through that portal. Another good place to look is GIS, and you can go to your city or county and type in GIS. And a lot of times they will have a mapping system where you can access your property, topo, and a couple other things like that. So that's another good resource to have. And then, making the preliminary decisions is the good place to start. That is, how much do you want to spend, how big the scope is of your project. If you're doing a small bed, you need to factor in, topsoil, amending your soil, mulch, all those kind of things need to come into, what you want to do. And then it gets harder as you start adding hardscape and the cost of that, because it can kind of get out of hand a little bit. Here's an example of a base plan. This basically just shows the house, shows the windows, shows the existing porch off the back, shows the garage and the driveway. And this allows you to kind of see how the house is placed on the site, how much space you have to both your back property line and then your side property lines. So it's nice to have this kind of area. And then the important thing to point out on this is the north area. Because I know Taylor's talked to y'all about like sunlight. So the north area is very important to put on there. So you know exactly how the sun's going to track across the site. And that helps you know which plant to put in based on shade and sun. Anybody have questions on the base plan? I think I see a hand raised. All right. So site analysis. And this is, I think, one of the most important parts of the design process, because this is really where you can discover things that will affect your overall design, even later on down to the final design. Site analysis is basically just walking through your site and writing down the characteristics of your site. It could be microclimates you experience, like this corner of the house gets a lot more shade. You know, during the summertime, it's an amazing place to sit out here because it's hot. If you sit right here, it's a perfect weather. So that's an example of a, you know, kind of a microclimate that you could write down, and you know that would be a cool seating area that you want to focus on. If you know things like pH, or if you notice drainage issues, if you have areas where water stands, if you have an area where there's a steep hill, those are things you can kind of write down on the site analysis phase of the design process. And then the other thing not to leave out is the aesthetic characteristics. So, you know, looking out, this view is amazing. I don't really like this view because my neighbor's got chickens and, you know, I'm trying to hide that view, or I have chickens and my neighbor doesn't like them, so I'm trying to situate those. The sounds, how it feels in the space. You know, there's so many different aesthetic characteristics, and it's going to be different for each person and what you want to focus and highlight on. So, you know, the physical characteristics are stuff that are kind of physical that you can see, and then aesthetic is a little more kind of personal and subjective to the person's house, or, you know, if you're doing it for your landscape to your house. Here's an example with taking that base plan and then adding some site analysis. You can see issues with like privacy. You know, this neighbor could be almost see right into your neighbor's house. So there's some privacy issues here. There's a slope. You can see where they've put the protected area from wind, where there's wildlife, where the living room is, and you have good views out. Those are all kind of characteristics that we talked about, some of them physical and some of them aesthetic, but it's a good place to put it down, because as you're working through the design, this will help you kind of focus some of the elements of your design to address these situations. And what's great about it is that it makes a design really unique to your house. So, you know, if 15 people put in, you know, raised bed gardens, if you really take the site analysis phase, you know, serious and spend a lot of time on it, they'll all come out different, and they'll all come out unique, and they'll all come out amazing, because each house is different. Even if you live, you know, right across the street from each other, you're going to have different views. You're going to have different areas where the sun hits better. Those are all important to write down the site analysis. And then after you have a base plan and after you've kind of made your site analysis, you go into conceptual design, or conceptual diagram. This one is a time for you to make a list of things you would like to accomplish, whether it's, you know, a new playground for your kids, or you want an area for your pets to go to the bathroom, or like I said, you want to plan for a chicken coop, or you want to do this or that. This is the area to do it. I want a new patio here. This is the time to kind of write that down and start trying to figure out how these elements work together. Things you can think about is storage, circulation, how you walk to the backyard. If you have friends over and you're entertaining, or people are going to walk through the house, or would you like to have a path that comes around to the back where they can access, you know, things like that are going to be, once again, subjective and up to your personal preference and the person you're designing for, and what they're really trying to focus on and highlight in the design process. You can also write down your aesthetic preferences, like your plant material, and certain plants, if you, like Taylor was talking about, if you really want a Japanese maple, or you really want to highlight some hydrangeas, and you want an amazing border garden with all these wildlife, you know, attractants, then, you know, this is the time to write that down. And then start making a list of your materials. So if you have a brick house and you're like, I don't know if I want a stone patio with a brick house, maybe I want a concrete patio, maybe it's stamped concrete. You know, this goes back to of the feel of your garden. So if you're doing a formal garden, you know, do you want that kind of more formal pattern? Any specialty elements that you might want, water feature, like I said, a swing set that overlooks a beautiful view. These are things that you can kind of make a list of. It just helps you when you're thinking through your design and your site. It helps you to have all these things in front of you so that you can start figuring out how these elements work together and support each other to to really make the best design you can for your house. Here's an example of conceptual diagram. You know, it starts out with the base and the site plan, and then it has the existing trees on here. It's got the slope. So these are the kind of the site analysis with your base map, and then an example of how you would work your conceptual diagram in is this, and it's really informal. And it's really, you know, creative, and this is the time you get to play with it. It doesn't have to be exact, like, oh, this is like a 10 by 10 patio. It could just be a bubble and just say, this is generally the idea of where I want it. This is how I want to define the space. This is kind of the general shape. This is the best place for it. And some people will take this as their final plan. So you can actually take this and say, all right, well, now I know where all these elements are going to fit in. I don't need a planting plan per se. I just know this is going to be the turf area. I'm going to get out there and move some plants around and figure out how the plants work. I'm going to talk to a deck builder and see if I want a 14-foot or 12 by 12 deck. You know, you can take this and run with it, but sometimes you need to take another step further, especially if you're doing designs or assisting someone else with their landscape. So the conceptual plan takes your conceptual diagram, which is bubbles and sketches, and then kind of defines it and refines it into a little bit more kind of exact, more exact, not perfectly exact, but more exact. And then that leads into your final design. And that conceptual design helps influence and helps define your final design. This is basically what plants, where you want to put them, how the whole site works together. Like I said, it could be your whole site. It could just be a bed. You know, you want to make sure everything's to the same scale. You want to make sure that you have a list of plant material, hardscape materials, and any additional notes that you may have noticed as a designer. So this is an example when it has kind of the landscape on the side, has the final pieces, has the hardscape materials, and then at the top, you can see the detail of how the fence and the bench work together on that. So this basically, you could hand this to somebody and they can go out and build that without having to really ask questions. All right, I know I kind of flew through that, but if y'all have any questions, I'm here to answer, and Taylor's here too to answer too.
Yeah, so that's just kind of, I wanted Drake to get to talk through that because he does this on a day-to-day basis, and this is something that he deals with. And like he said, you don't even have to get to that final design process. You do not have to be that exact. If it's your landscape and you're the one putting it in, you know what you want. But I love a good conceptual diagram. I don't often go beyond that myself because it just helps me visualize it. I'm a very visual person. And so if I'm just looking out there, I can kind of think it through, but if I have it on a paper and I can see it, that really helps me in the design process and picking out what goes where and what would do best. So having that site analysis and then going through to that conceptual diagram can really help guide your design. And you can go to the final design where you're putting out everything. Like he said, this is something that you could hand to me and I know nothing about your landscape and I could put it in exactly how you want it. This contains everything. You don't always have to go this far. But yeah, so those are the elements of design, kind of some of the practical principles, putting pen to paper. What questions do y'all have for us?
Okay, I just checked the chat box and there are no questions in there. So, I mean, if you want to open up your microphones and if you have any questions or comments, we've got a few minutes. 20 after 8. Getting lots of compliments.
Yeah,
Well, good.
It's a good
I
program.
feel like either we did a terrible job and we have made it so confusing that there are no questions, or maybe we did a really good job. And
Yeah.
everybody just,
wanted to ask about bed edging. I noticed somebody else put that question in. What is the best way to edge a flower bed which requires the least amount of fuss to keep up?
That is a difficult and $1,000,000 question. That's one of the hardest. To me, the best and easiest way is a shovel dug edge. It takes a little more work because you have to keep that kind of edge dug down deep below the mulch. Metal edging can work, just depending on your style and if you like that. I try to stay away from plastic because it just gets banged up, whether you weed eat against it or whether you're hit it with a lawnmower. Also, natural stone can make a really good edging, but it's of course more expensive. But in the kind of the long run, the maintenance of it is a little bit easier to take care of because you don't have to keep fixing it or replacing it. It's basically a kind of an easy way to find stuff. But the biggest issue you're going to have with those kind of metal, plastic, stone is that you're still going to have the grass or weeds trying to creep underneath it. So really that shovel dug edge as your bed edge, it helps with drainage. First of all, it helps catch water. It helps catch your mulch from washing into your grass or down the hill or wherever your bed's located. And it helps keep the roots of grass or whatever you're up against from creeping into the bed, which can be a huge lifesaver when it comes to maintenance.
Yeah, I would agree. So no matter what you do, shovel edging, like taking a shovel and digging it down around that bed line can help, especially if you've got Bermuda grass. It is one of the worst weeds in our flower beds because it creeps underground and above ground. So shovel edging and maintaining that shovel edge along your bed line will really help with creeping grasses getting in there.
Thank you. It's very helpful. It sounds like a lot of work.
It can be. I'll tell you, I love a good border plant, but border plants and weeds are just difficult. My parents have liriope or mondograss all around, and the weeds grow up in that, and it is just near impossible to control those.
Yeah, you just about have to tear everything out.
Yeah, you do. So having a non-living barrier of plastic, stone, metal, shovel edging makes somewhat of a better bed line than, say, a planting material.
I have a question.
Yes.
My question is as well with the flower bed. I have a friend of mine that I do some work at where he has the hedges that are there and they have the plastic barrier that goes around it. But when you cut the grass, it kind of shoots that stuff over in that. Now you put a lot of that lava rock stuff in there in that bed around the small bushes. What is the best way you think that would help to treat that where, because you take all this rock down, that's not realistic, I don't think. So what will you advise to kind of kill those weeds and everything that's going on around those bushes opposed to killing those things and that way?
Pre-emergent is going to be one of your best friends with a lot of those annual weeds, especially if it's annual like crabgrass or some of our annual broadleaf weeds. If you have an established planting bed where the shrubs are already well established, pre-emergent shouldn't be a detriment to them unless you're putting in like annuals or you're seeding flowers or something like that. If you've got established woody plants, you can use some pre-emergent in the spring and in the fall to kind of get some weed control. Selective herbicides, say they're grass weeds, you can maybe use some selective grass herbicides, but treating weeds in flower beds is difficult. And those weed barrier cloths only work for so long. Like you said, he's mowing and shooting stuff into there. And so it's sitting on top of that weed barrier. And so those weed barriers only work for so long. The good thing about the rock is, you could technically spray it and not harm it, but it's going to be a process of chemical control and mechanical hand pulling, unfortunately.
Ooh, we're trying to avoid. Trying to avoid that hand pulling now.
No, I know. If you know
something.
specifically what weeds, Carla could tell you probably a better strategy of how to control them. If you know, he can bring a sample or send a picture and we know what you're working with, it'll be easier to kind of guess. Like if you've got nutsedge, all the pre-emergent in the world's not going to help you kill nutsedge. So knowing what you've got is kind of the first step.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm finding I'm getting a lot of slugs in with the lava rock. They're just, yeah,
Slugs, is it?
yeah, slugs. This end of summer, I've been going out there and picking them up off the sidewalk and just getting rid of them.
Yeah.
Mm,
At least you're not
Diatomaceous-
stepping on them barefoot.
Yeah,
they're disgusting.
diatomaceous earth will work for those. Diatomaceous
Yeah.
earth or just salt. Salt can
Yeah.
harm your plants, so diatomaceous earth is really better to keep the snails and slugs back. You can just kind of do it or sprinkle it around your planting beds.
Yeah, I'm finding that they're mainly going to where our predecessor put down a lot of the lava rock, and those slugs just love being in that.
Yeah,
Mm.
sitting in the wet underneath those
Yeah.
rocks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Well, I'm not seeing anything else. And Taylor and Drake, it was nice to meet you.
Nice to meet y'all.
You
Thank y'all for
came
having
in
me.
and taught part of the program tonight. We appreciate both of you very much. And I believe we are down to 2 sessions to go after.
Woo!
Woo-hoo, we're about
Almost there,
done.
you guys.
Time flies when you're having fun. So all right. Well, again, thank you. And for everyone else, we will see you next Tuesday night.
Thanks, y'all. If you have questions, Carla's got my contact information. So feel free to send them my way.
Yep, I will send that out tomorrow or the next day.
Okay. That's perfectly
Thank
fine.
you.
Thank y'all so much. Have a good night.
Thank you very
Thanks so
much.
much.
All right,
Thank you.
bye-bye.